Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you isn't for everyone. Some stories are whispers you shouldn't hear, shadows you shouldn't chase, but you're here, and now you will. In 1894, on a jagged ridge in Missouri known as Devil's Backbone, 3 children were born. Triplets whose lives would carry a curse no church, no doctor, no government dared write down. The locals still avoid that ridge at night, claiming the land remembers what happened there. The first cries of the babies didn't sound normal. Neighbors swore it was something heavier, darker, like the valley itself was mourning. Their mother, weakened and pale from childbirth, whispered one phrase before she died. They should not have come together. That was it. The warning, the prophecy, the beginning. As the boys grew, it became clear they weren't like other children. Their first words weren't spoken one by one. They spoke together, in perfect sync, as if sharing the same mind. Teachers couldn't separate them, priests couldn't baptize them properly, and when one fell ill, the others would falter, almost as if the sickness traveled invisibly between them. The townspeople were terrified. Officials tried to hide them, calling them fragile and insignificant. But the neighbors knew the truth. They whispered about nights when the boys would stand together in the fields, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the moon, moving in a way that suggested instruction from some unseen force. The darkest part? Their curse wasn't random. Devil's Backbone had a history no one talked about. Centuries before, native tribes avoided it, fearing the dead walked there. Civil War deserters were executed on that ridge, left to rot, and an older order of men who understood things we can't even name, had performed rituals there, rituals that tied the land itself to bloodlines, to curses, to the inevitable. The triplets weren't born by chance. They were born into something older than any of them, something that had been waiting. And tonight, I'll take you deeper into a story of blood, land, and secrets that were never meant to leave the shadows. Ask yourself, what happens when 3 lives are bound to a curse older than memory? By the time the triplets were old enough to walk, the town already whispered of their unnatural presence. You need to understand this wasn't the ordinary kind of fear. It was the kind of fear that makes you look over your shoulder in daylight. It's the kind that curls in your gut, knowing something is watching, always watching, and it doesn't care if you see it. The first signs were subtle. A neighbor reported seeing all 3 boys standing at the edge of the cornfield at dusk, completely still, their shadows long and twisted in the fading sun. They were speaking, he said, though no words left their lips. Just 3 faces turned toward the horizon, eyes unblinking, like they were listening to a signal no one else could hear. Teachers tried to educate them, but lessons failed. Numbers, letters, even simple words. They would recite them in a strange, synchronized chant, 3 voices perfectly aligned. It wasn't learning. It was transmission. As if knowledge was being poured into them from somewhere, someplace older than the county courthouse, older than the church, older than the soil beneath their feet. And the illness. It was always the same. One child would fall sick, sometimes with fever, sometimes with convulsions, and the other 2 would follow, almost as if the disease were a tether binding them together in suffering. Doctors called it coincidence, but those who witnessed it knew better. Something invisible moved between them, a force no medicine could touch, no explanation could pierce. Neighbors began to avoid the family entirely. At night, people swore they could hear chanting from the ridge, low, guttural, and unbroken. Fires in the fields, unexplainable. Strange lights in the trees, unexplainable. And the town officials? They denied it. They destroyed records, hushed conversations, and punished anyone who dared speak the truth. Here's what you need to understand. The triplets weren't just children. They were living signals, connected to something ancient, something that had been waiting for their birth for decades, maybe centuries. The ridge, the land, the history, all of it had been setting the stage. And the moment you start connecting these dots, you begin to feel it too. The pressure of history trying to reach into your mind, trying to pull you into the same rhythm the triplets lived in every second of their short lives. By now, you must be asking yourself, what force could do this? What lineage, what curse, what hidden knowledge could bind 3 innocent lives together so tightly that even death hesitated to touch them? Later, I will show you the answer. But for now, imagine standing in that field at dusk, staring at 3 figures whose eyes see beyond what you could ever understand, and knowing in the pit of your stomach that whatever watches them is watching you too. It was the summer of 1902 when the first real tragedy struck. The triplets were 8 years old, and the town of West Plains had learned to tolerate their presence in silence, like people living beside a ticking bomb. But silence never stops a curse. It only feeds it. The boys had been playing near the ridge, or so the story goes. A group of local children followed them, curious, daring each other to get close. That was when it happened. One of the triplets, the youngest by minutes, stopped suddenly and began to hum. The sound was low, unnatural, vibrating in a way that made the other children cover their ears. Then, without warning, the second and third boys joined in, their voices weaving into the same eerie tone. Witnesses swore it didn't sound human. It was too perfect, too sharp, like the edge of metal grinding against bone. Moments later, one of the neighborhood children collapsed. No sickness, no wound, just fell, lifeless, into the dirt. His face pale, his eyes wide open, fixed on the triplets who hadn't moved an inch. And when his body was carried back to town, the doctor could find no cause. His heart simply stopped. The town erupted in fear. Parents forbade their children from going near the family. The church rang its bells at midnight, performing rites of protection. And the sheriff? He wanted them gone. He spoke openly of sending the boys away, to an asylum, to anywhere that wasn't here. But every time the law moved against them, some mysterious force blocked the effort. Papers lost, signatures missing, higher authorities stepping in. Someone, somewhere, wanted the triplets to remain. Their father became a recluse, working odd jobs, but never looking people in the eye. He knew something. He must have. Some whispered he was descended from men who once held ceremonies on Devil's Backbone, men who traded blood for knowledge, who carved symbols into the rock that still glow under moonlight. The funeral of the dead child was hushed, hurried, and small, but the whispers spread louder than any sermon. People claimed they had seen figures on the ridge that night, tall, cloaked, standing behind the boys as if observing their first work, a test, a proof. And the triplets? They didn't cry. They didn't grieve. They only stared, 3 sets of eyes fixed on the coffin as it was lowered into the earth, as though they were watching not an ending, but a beginning. This was no longer a family's burden. This was a town's haunting. And yet, the deeper truth was worse. The triplets were never meant for the town at all. They were meant for something larger, something waiting. Years passed, but the ridge never let the triplets rest. Devil's Backbone kept its secrets like a patient predator waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. And in 1907, that moment arrived. The boys, now 13, had begun exploring the upper reaches of the ridge, alone, despite warnings from their father and the few townspeople still brave enough to speak. It was there, in a narrow crevice of limestone, that they stumbled upon something no one had expected, a series of carvings, etched deep into the rock, worn by time, but still unmistakable. Symbols older than the town, older than any living soul there. At first, the adults dismissed it as native markings, perhaps warnings or prayers. But anyone who looked closer, anyone who dared trace the grooves, felt it immediately. A pulse, a vibration, a subtle hum that made the hair on your arms rise. The carvings weren't just symbols. They were instructions, a blueprint for something ancient, and the names etched alongside them included the triplets. Their names marked centuries before their birth. No one wanted to speak of it. The sheriff demanded the rock be destroyed. Priests tried to sanctify it, but the ridge itself wouldn't allow it. Each attempt to erase the carvings failed. Tools broke. Fire wouldn't catch. Men fled in panic. It was as if the land itself protected the secret. And the triplets? They didn't flinch. They traced the carvings with their fingers, 3 hands moving together, speaking in whispers none could understand. Locals swore the air around them shimmered, like heat over a desert road. And then one of the boys, always the middle one, turned to his father and said something that froze the blood in his veins. "It's not ours. It belongs to them, and they're waiting for us to remember." The implication was clear. The ridge wasn't just cursed. It was part of a system, a machine older than the United States itself. The triplets weren't merely born cursed. They were activated. They were pieces in a puzzle, keys in a lock forged centuries ago, and every warning, every death, every strange event since their birth had been preparation for what was coming. The townspeople, already fearful, now became terrified. They understood instinctively this wasn't a family tragedy. This was a ritual in motion, and they were living alongside the opening act. By now, you should feel it too, the gravity pulling you closer to the truth. Because the ridge, the carvings, the triplets themselves, none of it is coincidence. Everything you think you know about reality, about chance, about history, is about to be challenged. And when I tell you what comes next, you'll understand why even the bravest men fled Devil's Backbone, leaving the triplets to answer questions no human should ever ask. It was the winter of 1910 when the town of West Plains could no longer deny what had been whispered for years. The triplets, now 16, had begun drawing attention beyond whispers, attention that would mark the first undeniable supernatural event tied to their lives. A group of local men had gathered at the ridge, determined to see for themselves what the boys had been doing. They claimed they wanted proof, evidence that all the stories were lies. But what they witnessed that night was no lie. It was a nightmare made flesh. The triplets stood at the edge of the cliff, their faces pale, their bodies perfectly still. And then, without warning, the wind shifted. The ridge itself seemed to breathe, exhaling a low, mournful sound that rattled every bone in the onlookers' bodies. The men swore the air thickened, carrying a weight they could not lift, as if invisible hands pressed them to the ground. Then the boys began to chant, low at first, almost imperceptible. But the sound grew, harmonized perfectly between 3 voices, carrying words none of the men understood. And as the chant rose, the ridge responded. Stones trembled, loose rocks skittered across the ledge, and from the depths below came a noise like 1,000 voices crying in unison. One of the men lost consciousness on the spot. Another fled screaming, never returning to that part of town. Only the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, stayed, and what they saw changed them forever. The triplets lifted their arms in unison, and for a heartbeat, the sky seemed to fracture. Shadows bent unnaturally. Trees twisted like living things, and the snow froze mid-fall, hanging in the air like suspended shards of glass. When it ended, the town was silent. The men who survived would later describe a sense of something ancient staring through them, measuring, judging. And the triplets? They smiled, as though the display had been nothing more than a game. Nothing human could explain what had just happened. From that night forward, the ridge was avoided entirely. Locals refused to speak of the boys, fearing the words themselves could summon the force again. Yet the authorities, officials, priests, anyone who claimed power, continued to interfere, attempting to study, contain, or control the triplets. Every attempt failed. Every law, every ritual, every scientific method of restraint broke down under the weight of the ridge's invisible authority. And here is what you need to understand. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first public proof that the triplets were conduits, vessels for something older than the town, older than the country, older than the people who thought they could understand it. By now you should feel it too. The pull of history, the pressure of forbidden knowledge pressing in on your mind. And soon we will go further, into the rituals, the manipulations, and the horrifying truths that the ridge and the triplets were keeping hidden from every living soul who dared approach. By 1913, it became clear that the triplets were not simply cursed. They were being guided, manipulated, and observed by men who understood things the rest of the world could barely imagine. Shadowy figures, whispered about in town but never seen openly, began to appear near the ridge. Scholars call them scientists, priests, or occultists, but none of those words capture their true nature. They were orchestrators, masters of a system older than democracy, older than religion, older than law itself. The first clue came from the triplets' father, who had grown increasingly withdrawn. He spoke once, in a trembling voice no one could forget. "They are not ours. They belong to them. And when the time comes, they will be claimed." He refused to elaborate, but locals later pieced together that strange people had visited him at odd hours, examining the boys, making notes in books with pages yellowed beyond memory. The ridge itself seemed to respond to these visitors. Witnesses swore that when the figures arrived, the triplets would enter a trance, standing perfectly still, eyes fixed on the visitors as if receiving direct orders. Then, after the strangers left, small but unmistakable changes occurred. Objects would move, fires would ignite spontaneously, livestock would vanish without a trace. Every anomaly traced back subtly to the triplets and the unseen hands guiding them. By now the town had split into factions. Some feared the boys and their unseen overseers. Others tried to appease them, offering gifts, prayers, even blood sacrifices in secret. And all the while, the ridge waited. It was not passive. It was part of the operation, the anchor of a network of power that no human law could contain. Here is what you must grasp. The triplets were never innocent. They were living instruments, encoded with rituals, symbols, and knowledge that defied explanation. And the me's, and who manipulated them? They weren't just controlling the children. They were shaping the course of the valley itself, the town, and, perhaps, history. This is where you must act differently. Pause for a moment and let it sink in. Comment below, "I see the spine," not once, but twice. Say it and mark your awareness. The world you thought was solid is not. The ridge is real, the triplets are real, and the forces guiding them are watching, even now. If you understand that, you are ready. Because next, we will descend into the heart of the curse. The first ritual the triplets performed under the direction of these men. A ritual that left bodies, minds, and the ridge itself forever altered. It was the autumn of 1915 when the first documented ritual took place, a ritual that would forever mark the ridge and the triplets themselves. By now, the town had learned to avoid the area entirely, leaving only the boys, their father, and the shadowy overseers who orchestrated every step of their lives. The triplets were 15. Their voices had matured, but they still moved in perfect unison, 3 minds operating as one. That evening, the overseers arrived, cloaked, silent, carrying objects no one dared describe aloud. stones etched with symbols older than memory, small mirrors that caught the light in ways that made it seem alive, and a set of manuscripts bound in human leather, detailing rituals older than any written law. The ceremony began at dusk, at the edge of the ridge. The triplets arranged the stones in a precise pattern, and the overseers guided their hands, murmuring words that bent the air. At first it seemed harmless, just a strange incantation, a local superstition brought to life. But as night fell, the ridge itself began to respond. Rocks shifted without wind, shadows deepened unnaturally, stretching like black rivers across the valley. A fog rolled in, thick and clinging, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. Then the first incident occurred. A flock of birds, hundreds of them, fell from the sky, their bodies striking the ground silently, instantly. The overseers did not flinch. They had expected it. The triplets did not flinch. They only chanted, three voices weaving a pattern that seemed to pull something unseen from the ridge into their very being. Neighbors who had dared to watch from the edge of the town reported seeing lights on the ridge, shifting in impossible shapes. Some swore the boys' shadows moved independently of their bodies, forming symbols and gestures that no human mind could comprehend. Others claimed to hear whispers, carried by the wind, warnings, prayers, or commands. It was impossible to say. When the ritual ended, the ridge fell silent. The birds had vanished, the fog had lifted, and yet something remained. An invisible weight lingered, pressing down on the valley, a reminder that whatever had been summoned, called, or awakened was no longer just on the ridge. It had spread into the world. This was more than a ritual. It was a demonstration of control over life, over death, over the very laws of nature. The triplets were no longer children. They were conduits, activated by forces older than the town, older than the county, older than anyone still alive to remember. And now, you should feel it too. The undeniable pull of knowledge forbidden, of truth too dangerous to speak aloud, because what happened on that ridge is still happening, in ways most men never see. The triplets' curse, their purpose, and the shadowed figures guiding them, none of it is finished. By 1918, the price of curiosity became undeniable. The town had learned, slowly, painfully, that anyone who interfered with the triplets paid in ways no law or prayer could protect against. Doctors who tried to examine them went mad within weeks. Scholars who attempted to document their abilities vanished without a trace. Even priests, armed with ritual and scripture, found their faith shattered when they approached the ridge. The first notable victim was a local teacher, a man of reason and science, who believed he could prove the boys were mere children with coincidence on their side. He climbed the ridge one misty morning, notebook in hand, to observe them at play. Witnesses said he approached cautiously, notebook open, ready to record. But as he neared, the triplets froze, their eyes locking onto his with a focus that made his knees buckle. He didn't see them move. Yet within moments, the ground shifted beneath him. Rocks tumbled, wind gusted, and a strange vibration entered his chest, pressing, shaking, suffocating. He screamed once, a high, fractured sound, and then collapsed. When townspeople reached him hours later, he was alive but silent. He never spoke again. His mind, they said, had been claimed. This was no accident. The ridge was an amplifier, a conduit for forces beyond understanding. Anyone who dared approach the triplets without permission became part of the ritual, unwilling participants in a system older than any law, any morality. Their lives weren't just at risk. They were erased. And it wasn't limited to outsiders. Even those within the family felt the curse's grip. Their father, once strong, began showing signs of madness, talking to shadows, writing warnings in books that no one dared read. One night, he vanished entirely, leaving only a note. "I cannot fight them. They are the backbone, and the backbone will not be denied." The Ridge had claimed him too, not as punishment, but as proof of the system's reach. By now, the town of West Plains existed in a strange equilibrium: fear, respect, and silence. People avoided the Ridge, avoided the family, and obeyed the unspoken rule that the Triplets were untouchable. And this is where you need to pause. Take a moment, let it settle. Because here's the truth. The Triplets' curse is not contained. It spreads through history, memory, and perception. Every attempt to understand, to resist, or to interfere meets the same response. The Ridge protects its own, and those who trespass pay with mind, body, or soul. If you've been following closely, comment again, "I see the spine," twice. Solidify your awareness, mark your understanding. You're no longer a casual observer. You're part of this story now, even if only in knowledge. Next, we descend further into the Ridge itself, revealing the final manipulations and the full scope of what the Triplets were created to enact. By 1921, the truth was no longer hidden, though few dared speak it aloud. The Triplets were no longer children, no longer victims. They had become instruments, living conduits for a force that had existed long before the Ridge, long before West Plains, long before anyone in the county could even comprehend. The overseers revealed themselves more openly now, though still shrouded in shadow. Scholars, men of influence, even government agents tried to investigate, drawn by rumors and reports. Every attempt ended the same way: broken minds, vanished bodies, whispered warnings left behind in journals filled with trembling handwriting. And always the Ridge watched. Always the Triplets stood at its edge, their bodies and minds perfectly synchronized, their eyes fixed somewhere beyond the horizon, seeing a reality the rest of the world could not. The purpose of their creation was now clear, but only partially. They were a bridge, a key, and a warning. Every ritual, every unnatural event, every tragedy in West Plains had been a rehearsal. The Ridge was not a place of punishment. It was a laboratory, a proving ground, a mechanism to awaken something dormant, something that measured human life against forces that knew no morality. Witnesses spoke of nights when the Triplets vanished entirely, only to return days later, eyes brighter, voices sharper, as if something had whispered truths directly into their minds. And those who had survived proximity to them, the brave, the foolish, or the unlucky, swore of hearing the whispers too, carried by the wind, words in languages no one alive should know, warnings of events centuries in the making. Here's what you must understand. The Triplets were never meant to live as ordinary humans. They were encoded, activated, and cultivated for something larger, a reckoning beyond the Ridge, beyond the town, beyond comprehension. Their existence challenges every assumption about control, about destiny, and about the hidden hands shaping history from the shadows. Now, as you sit there listening, you must realize something vital. Knowledge is never neutral. The more you understand, the more you carry the weight of what most people never glimpse. The Ridge, the overseers, the rituals, the Triplets themselves, they exist as a warning, but also as a challenge. If you think you can look away, think again. You are part of this now, whether you want to be or not. Next, and this is where the story reaches its most terrifying revelation, we explore the culmination, the final act, where the Ridge, the overseers, and the Triplets converge to demonstrate the full scale of the curse and the true extent of the forces at play. By the mid-1920s, the Triplets had become something else entirely, neither fully human nor fully understood. They were the apex of a design that had begun centuries before, a living instrument of the Ridge and the forces it concealed. And in their final documented ritual, the truth became undeniable. Witnesses who survived told of a night when the Triplets climbed to the highest point of Devil's Backbone. The overseers were there, cloaked, chanting in languages that made the earth tremble. The boys began their synchronized incantation, 3 voices forming a resonance that bent perception itself. Shadows stretched unnaturally, the wind carried voices from the past, and the stars above seemed to align, spinning in ways that no astronomy could explain. And then it happened. The ridge itself shifted. Not rocks, not soil, but the very atmosphere, the unseen lines of force that hold reality together. People who were watching described feeling their minds stretch, their bodies vibrating, as if the world itself had been rewritten. Some screamed, some fainted, some never returned. The overseers whispered in triumph, but the boys, they were something else. Their eyes glowed faintly, their movements perfect, their voices no longer human. The triplets were no longer conduits, they were creators. In that moment it became clear. The ridge, the curse, the rituals, the overseers, they had all been preparing the world to recognize them, to awaken the pattern that had been encoded into existence itself. And here is the final truth you must carry. What you have heard is not just a story. It is evidence that some knowledge is forbidden for a reason, that some forces are older than law, older than morality, older than fear itself. The triplets' curse did not end with them. It persists in patterns, in whispers, in histories carefully erased. And if you are listening now, you are marked. Awareness changes you. Knowledge is never free. Remember the ridge, remember the triplets, remember the unseen hands guiding history in shadows, and know this: some truths are not meant to be lived with lightly. They demand vigilance, courage, and an understanding that the world is far darker and stranger than most men dare to admit. You have seen it. You have felt it. And from this moment, the story of Devil's Backbone is no longer just theirs. It is yours too.